Uncertainty is basically our biggest problem in aviation's decarbonization process. That's what I got from the conversation with Tom Conlon today. We spoke about why aviation is supposedly one of the hardest sectors to abate. And on top of that, we delved into the Aviation Sustainability Index, a concept that Tom and colleagues developed, a scientifically vetted concept that is supposed to reduce some of these uncertainties. Tom Conlon is a professor of finance at the University College Dublin Business School. Before joining academia, he has worked in asset management and as a consultant in financial services. But next to all of this, Tom is also the lead of Impact's science workstream. And with that, one of the masterminds behind the milestone concept. That's why I'm really excited to have Tom in today's episode of Impactful Voices. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Leonie. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Very well.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk today a little bit about why aviation in the first place is so difficult to decarbonize, and at the same time, what potential mechanisms or concepts could help a little bit on making it easier. I'm so excited that you're here to talk with us about this. I feel like we've been in the same digital room so many times, but never gotten the chance to actually really talk. So I'm really grateful that we can have this time today and have a little bit more of a conversation. But yeah, I think before we delve into what the ASI is or what potential solutions there are, let's set the stage a little bit and just talk about why is aviation even so hard to decarbonize. It's often described as one of the hardest sectors to abate, but why is that? What makes it so fundamentally difficult?
Sure, look, thanks for the invitation. Delighted to be here today. Why is aviation so difficult to decarbonise? Where do we start? There's so many different reasons. Look, let's take the industry as a whole. Aviation is in itself a very challenging industry. It's a really competitive industry. What does an airline do? They fly, they move passengers over distance. And in essence, that's commoditized. No, you're indifferent whether you're on a 737 belonging to airline A or airline B. Really doesn't make that much difference to you. So because of this, airlines are really competitive and they earn very low margins. And then the other thing is, if you think about what's happening in the current war in the Middle East and what that has done, jet fuel prices have doubled in just 10 days. So a fuel shock like this will lead to huge losses in the industry. And it just gives you a sense as to how sensitive the industry is to profitability or to challenges to its profitability. The real issue is that airlines are going to struggle to be able to afford the vast costs that are associated with decarbonisation. These costs are going to have to either be passed on to consumers or they're going to have to be paid for in some other way. So aviation has issues with CO2. So trying to reduce the amount of CO2 that's coming from the industry accounts for, depending on who you ask, somewhere in the region of about 2% of global CO2. But that's just one side of the problem when we think about aviation. Aviation also has to deal with contrails. So what are contrails? They're the clouds of ice crystals that form behind an aircraft. And the latest science suggests that they may hold as much responsibility for climate change as the CO2 that comes from aviation itself. So in terms of how we're going to get there, some of the tools exist right now. So we take Sustainable Aviation Fuel. Sustainable Aviation Fuel is a drop-in fuel that we can use in current aircraft. The challenges with Sustainable Aviation Fuel is scaling it. The approach that's available to us right now, which is called HEFA. HEFA is hydrogenated esters and fatty acids. Effectively, it's the oil that's left over from McDonald's. They use that and process it to create sustainable aviation fuel. It's limited though in terms of the quantities of that we can get. So we can get about 10% of, at most, about 10% of demand from that. Then we move on to biofuels. When we look at biofuels, we're starting to compete with with food. And then we go on to power to liquid. Power to liquid is an e-fuel. And this e-fuel requires vast amount of electricity to allow us to be able to create it, renewable electricity to be able to create it. We don't have sufficient renewable electricity at the moment. And we're also competing with lots of other areas. So we're competing, for example, with the development of data centers for AI. And that seems to win in every sense. Some of the other tools that are available to us, so hydrogen or maybe electric aircraft, for example, are in reality decades away in terms of large-scale application. It's going to be very difficult for us to actually have these while the current generation of aircraft are flying. So, other side, the final big issue that aviation is encountering, that other industries aren't encountering to the same extent, is that emissions are growing. Each year we're emitting a greater amount of emissions than the previous year. And this is in spite of refleeting. So refleeting means replacing the older aircraft with new aircraft. And that should provide us with some amount of a reduction in terms of emissions. But it's not sufficient to outdo the growth that the industry is facing. So in order for aviation to get to net zero, it really needs more than what we would say is tinkering at the margins. The industry requires a total transformation. And that total transformation carries enormous amounts of risk.
Okay, so when we're talking risk, what do you mean by that? Enormous amounts of risk. That is a broad term. Can you break that down?
Very simple. Risk is uncertainty. Nobody likes uncertainty. And the people who like uncertainty the least are financiers. When they're looking to make a bet, they're risk averse, okay? They're looking for low risk investments. They want these investments to have the potential for high upside. And that sort of leads them then to provide capital to areas where technology is advanced, or alternatively to areas where government supports are already in place. So it's removing the uncertainties. Aviation hasn't got that yet. In aviation, what we've seen has been a focus on new airframes and on new engines. And this does give us some benefit from the perspective of decarbonisation. But what we know is that these emitting aircraft are going to continue to fly for another 20 to 25 years. So for new aircraft that comes on stream. The other thing that investors are doing right now, which I think is a real problem for aviation, and it's going to become more of a problem for aviation, is that rather than simply supporting an emitting sector in its transition, which effectively makes an investor look bad because their portfolio looks like it's more emitting, what they are preferring to do is to screen out fossil fuel heavy industries. So think about coal, think about oil and gas. Investors would rather not have this in a portfolio at all, rather than support them in terms of transitioning towards biofuels, for example. So that's a challenge, because that's going to move into aviation as time goes forward, if it becomes inconvenient from a portfolio perspective. The other risk that we encounter, the other challenge that we encounter, relates to sustainable financing. Sustainable financing would be a perfect setup for aviation, but it hasn't really grown within aviation to the extent that you might imagine. And this, we believe, is down to the lack of a strong KPI, a strong greenwashing proof KPI that can be used as a metric to measure success. The last thing, to your point about uncertainty, is regulation. Regulation, or uncertainty around regulation, then creates risks. For example, in aviation, who's going to ultimately pay for decarbonisation? We're talking about something that's going to cost in the region of $5 maybe to $7 trillion out to 2050. Is it going to be the airlines? Is it going to be passengers? Or is it going to be government? That really hasn't been resolved in any way. The other danger is that regulations could change in future. The EU comes out with a set of regulations, and they realise that these regulations are unpalatable, or potentially that they're untenable, and then they go and change them in the future. That creates uncertainty for investors. The other thing relates to mandates. The mandates that we have in Europe right now are higher. In fact, they're higher than what we think will be produced in terms of SAF in the future. And that's going to cause a problem, I think, in the future. Other uncertainties, lots of macroeconomic uncertainty at the moment with everything that's going on. But another challenge here is that we have different rules. So internationally, we have different playing fields. The US tends to use the carrot. They have tended to support businesses in terms of developing sustainable aviation fuel, for example. Europe has leaned more towards the stick. And the danger with this is that it'll make the US more attractive than the EU from an investment perspective. We could go on. There's the lack of revenue guarantees for SAF producers. And the comparison there is with renewable electricity. Renewable electricity, the producers have gotten lots of guarantees from policymakers regarding the price that they're going to get. SAF producers aren't getting this. So without this price signal, it makes it very difficult for them to start to produce sufficient SAF. So look, the result of all this, of the uncertainties that we encounter, is that effectively investors are going to sit on the fence and they're going to wait. In essence, that's going to create more uncertainty.
It's like a cycle.
Exactly.
But Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to ask if it's more, but you kind of answered with all the examples that it's not necessarily only or mainly political uncertainty, economic uncertainty. It's kind of uncertainty in all or aspects. So
Yeah.
that's definitely not helping. You mentioned it a little bit, but I'm curious to know, just because it's a very current topic, how can these geopolitical events right now create additional uncertainty?
Oh gosh, well, if you have somebody in an office that is coming out with tweets at 3 o'clock in the morning and the market is responding to these tweets, that creates considerable uncertainty. You know, I think that's the way I think about it. Investors, as I said, investors like to know what's going to happen in the future. There's an index, well-known economic index called the Economic Uncertainty Index, and it measures the extent to which we know about what's going to happen in economic terms in the future. Right now, that's particularly high, as you can imagine. The challenge that faces is if you're a company and you're looking to invest, so you're looking to put money to work, you're looking to build out capacity, you're sitting on the fence because you think, well, I might as well wait because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know how the rules are going to be, what the economy is going to look like, what might happen in terms of the geopolitical environment. And because I don't know this, I'm not going to invest. So what's the knock-on impact of that? It flows through to the creation of jobs. It flows through to GDP. It potentially flows through to inflation. All of these are uncertainties that we don't like as investors.
But how does it work now when I'm thinking about putting myself in the shoes of an investor, let's say? Couldn't you also argue that these things that are uncertain right now, the conditions could even become worse? Like not acting now could even become a disadvantage?
Yeah.
Because uncertain means both ways. It's uncertain if the conditions become better or worse, right? So isn't that, like a counter argument?
Yeah, no, absolutely. What are the uncertainties that aviation faces? Let's think about that for an example. From climate change, obviously. By having this uncertainty right now, we're creating further uncertainty down the line, and we're thinking about things like climate risk. So climate risk can be broken out into kind of two categories. We have physical climate risk, which is the risks that will come from the damage that might happen from changes in temperature or extra rain and so on. And if you are an airline and you're flying into an airport, potentially that airport might be closed. That creates a loss for you in terms of earnings. So that's a fairly small example. What the financiers are worried about is more transition risk. So imagine we come to the position in 5 or maybe 10 years' time where we realise that climate change is unstoppable. We've hit, let's say, 2 degrees of climate change. The amount of damage that's happening has increased year on year. Regulators finally decide to do something about it. What does that mean for aviation? Well, they might, for example, say to aviation, you've been naughty. You haven't been reducing your emissions as we expected you to, so we're going to put caps on you. We're going to limit the amount that you can grow year on year. What does that do then to aircraft? So aircraft are a tradable asset. I could sell an aircraft to another lessor or to another airline, and if it's the case that there's less demand for those aircraft, it's going to change the price of the aircraft. Now, the key here is that as a financier, I'm looking at this because this is the collateral that supports the lending. It's the security underpinning the lending. And by damaging that security or that collateral, we might be impacting upon the ability of the banks to be able to lend to the industry. So again, as you said earlier, it all comes full cycle.
It's so complex. Now, when we're trying to move forward, we've talked about what is the challenge. It's big uncertainty in a lot of areas. Specifically, we've been talking about financiers. They hate uncertainty. So we've established that. And now, naturally, the key question is how to move forward. What do you see as some of the most promising solutions to overcome these financial barriers and overcome those uncertainties that are holding investors back, basically?
Sure. Look, what's the challenge right now? The uncertainty we have, if I'm an investor, and I'm looking at aviation as a possible investment. And even if I'm looking at SAF, for example, as a possible investment, I don't know which SAF pathways are going to win out. What's going to be the ultimate solution, or what is going to be the form of eSAF that's going to scale best? So in order to find that out, what do we need to do? We need to experiment. We need to run lots of relatively cheap experiments, and then we figure out which one of the solutions will actually scale. Now, when I say relatively cheap, these could cost billions of dollars, but relative to the $5 to $8 trillion that the industry requires to decarbonize, this is a pittance. Very, very little. So what does this do? It removes the uncertainty that's associated with funding the wrong solutions. That's what we're trying to avoid. If investors are afraid they're going to fund the wrong solution and there isn't enough upside to compensate them for that, they just won't get involved. And I think that's what aviation is encountering right now. The second thing that I think we need to do is to find a way to reward investors. So we want them to take on risks. We want them to invest in these radically cleaner technological systems. But we need to know that this is actually having an impact. So one example of this might be blended finance, for example, where we could use public funds to absorb some of the risks that are associated with decarbonisation. And as I said earlier, airlines by themselves, they're living in this very competitive, low-margin industry. They're very unlikely to be able to come up with sufficient capital to decarbonise all by themselves. So what this would do then is allow a lot more risk-conscious capital to come into the space. Why? Because effectively you're putting this guarantee in place over the first loss. The biggest, or the first people to lose out would not be the investors. And then what you'll find is that there'll be lots of money that will flow into aviation. An important part of this isn't new. This isn't something that we haven't done before. If you look at renewable electricity and renewable sources of electricity, we've been doing this for decades. Governments have been supporting the decarbonisation of power generation for at least 2 decades now. So we're not suggesting something that is unique to aviation. I think that the last part of this then is once we figure out what works, then we need to get lots of capital into aviation. And we need to get this capital through to aviation in the short run. If we're really serious about aviation getting to net zero by 2050, we can't delay this. And the reason for that is very simple. If we take a sustainable aviation fuel plant, this takes somewhere in the region of, to go from conception through to full capacity, maybe 5, probably more like 8 years to get there. So the other thing is we need thousands of these. We don't just need a few, we need thousands of them globally. So the longer we wait, the greater the challenge is going to be. We're going to be challenged in terms of capacity, we're going to be challenged in terms of the cost of actually doing this. So by putting this down the line, we're not helping ourselves at all.
Right. It's interesting to me that you also mentioned as a comparison renewable energy, because in another conversation I had with Adam, it was the same example. Now I'm wondering, maybe you don't have the answer, but what you think is, why has it worked with renewable energy and why does it seem so difficult with aviation? Is it just because the political will was different, or what does still differentiate? If we're drawing that comparison, still something must be different, right?
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of things that are different. There is a perception that air travel is for the wealthy. What I mean by that is that it generally tends to be people. If you look at the amount of people that are traveling worldwide, the vast majority of those are coming from developed economies. So we have a growing middle class in China and India. They're going to, as they become wealthier, they're going to want to fly. They're going to increase. They're going to need an increase in capacity in aviation to support them as well. But the challenge there is something that we come across in lots of different areas. That in developing economies, they look at this and go, well, developed economies got away with this for the last 100 or 150 years. They were able to continue to produce emissions. Why shouldn't we be allowed to do it? So how do we deal with that? How do we convince governments in emerging economies, in addition to those in developed economies, in order to effectively, it's going to require tax ultimately, and trying to sell tax to people is always going to be a challenge.
Yeah, that's true. It's so cool because I had this question written down of, are there examples from other sectors that aviation could learn from? And you just mentioned the same one that in another conversation was mentioned. So that's interesting to hear. But now when we're talking about these financial barriers and reducing risk, I know that you've been working on a mechanism to do so, a concept. So can you tell us how that would work? Because now we've just heard how it's almost impossible to get these investors to invest because the uncertainty is there. And how do we remove that? How does it go away?
Yeah, sure. So look, we've been working on something, myself and colleagues, David Victor, Andreas Schaefer and Philip Goodking, have been working on this for a few years now. And I suppose that the origins of it is discussions that we had with industry, particularly with banks who want to be able to support sustainability-linked financing. So what we did to help the industry, try to help them to be able to create and to grow the area of sustainability-linked financing in aviation, is created what we call the ASI, the Aviation Sustainability Index. The best way to think about this is it's a greenwashing-proof approach to allow the aviation industry to measure success in terms of decarbonisation. Another important aspect of it, I think it's worth mentioning, is that the tool that we've proposed can also be applied to other sectors. It doesn't necessarily just have to be in aviation. Now, this could be applied to other forms of transport or to steel, for example. It's the same sort of idea. What we're trying to measure is decoupling. So what does it do? It measures how much an airline or an aviation investment decouples its traffic from growth in emissions. If we think about getting to net zero in aviation, this is all about decoupling. It's not about intensity. Intensity is a metric we hear covered quite significantly in terms of aviation, and it's the metric that gets quoted very considerably. The challenge is, what we've seen in aviation is since the dawn of the jet age, we've had improvements in intensity almost every year. But at the same time, we see aggregate emissions continue to increase. So focusing on intensity by itself won't be enough. The other side to it is aviation does need growth. In order for aviation to decarbonize, it's going to have growth. Growth is going to be needed to pay for or to support the decarbonisation process. So in essence, you could think of the Aviation Sustainability Index as analogous to a more familiar credit rating. It uses bands to allow investors to identify what we could consider to be investment grade sustainability projects. The other things that it does is it allows us to compare airlines, it allows us to assess progress in the industry on an overall basis, and also to act as a barometer as to how well the industry is performing in terms of decarbonisation. Now, how can it be used in practice? Well, what it'll allow us to do is to support decarbonisation by incentivising performance. So think of it this way. If we had a bank and an airline, and between them they agree a certain target ASI score, we sometimes refer to it as the milestone score within impact. So when the airline gets there, when they hit this score, they get rewarded. And those rewards could be that their cost of borrowing is reduced by some amount. We don't set a time limit on this, and this is what separates this approach from other approaches that are out there. The faster that you do it, the earlier that you're going to get the rewards. And this comes back to something you mentioned earlier. It's sort of self-perpetuating. If you have an airline that commits to decarbonisation and who succeeds at decarbonisation, they're going to have a strategic advantage. And that strategic advantage is the fact that they're going to be able to access capital cheaper than their competitors. The other thing that we think is really important about the ASI is that policymakers can use it as a way to support blended capital. So I referred to blended finance earlier on. So what it would allow policymakers to do is to identify which projects are truly groundbreaking in terms of deep decarbonisation and to support those projects. I suppose though it's worth pointing out that this work with my co-authors has now been published in Science. This is the leading international peer-reviewed journal. And I guess what's important about that is it means that the ASI now has the blessings of the scientific community. So look, to put it in perspective, what the ASI will do is allow us to introduce and to scale true sustainability-linked capital in aviation and to support the aviation industry in terms of its decarbonisation.
Yeah, right. So first of all, congratulations on the publication. I think that's a really, really big achievement.
Thank you.
And it just proves basically what you were saying, that it works and that policymakers can use it as a base and just has to be pushed forward. Now, when we talk about today, where do you see today would be the most momentum, where it's easiest to get quick transformation?
Which areas of aviation?
Yes.
Gosh, the quickest... Okay, what I regularly hear as being the quickest tool that aviation has, but as yet unproven, is in contrail avoidance. So contrail avoidance may contribute about 50, maybe even more than 50% of all of aviation's climate change impact. And to adjust this, or to better to manage to reduce this, the tools that we have are probably pretty quick. It's about changing the altitude of a flight, or changing maybe slightly the timing of a flight to avoid those periods of cold that create contrails. So the costs in terms of doing that are very minimal. But again, it comes back to something I mentioned earlier. We still don't know for certain. We can't measure with certainty, to the best of my knowledge, how much the contrails impact climate change. So we need these experiments. We need small-scale experiments that will allow us to be able to determine definitively the impact of contrails. And the cost of this could be a fraction of what decarbonising in terms of CO2, a traditional climate decarbonisation, is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, like you say, it's still uncertain. And that's where the ASI is doing so much work, is it puts this uncertainty out of the way, and you can actually work on decoupling and therefore already establishing decarbonized aviation sector in the future by integrating that today. Yeah. Whilst other levers might have a bigger impact, like you say, contrails, but they're today, as of today, too uncertain. So kind of circling back to the uncertainty that we literally spoke about the first part of this conversation. It's really interesting. I think also when you're saying that, I mean, aviation is like new to me since I started with Impact, but that topic of the investments in those experiments, yes, there are large sums, but then compared to the cost of climate change and the risks that are on the horizon, it's a fraction. But you encounter that problem and that messaging to people in all sectors. It's really interesting. And
it is. Look, I think that the challenge there is that human beings, to kind of tarnish us all, we're really bad at long-term thinking. We're concerned with what's going to happen in the short term. So what's happening in the next year, maybe the next 5 years, but beyond that, we're very poor at taking into account the chances of things happening. And if you think about this from the perspective of a corporation, be it an airline or a lessor or whatever, the CEO of that company likely isn't going to be around in 5 years' time. Right now, he's fighting, or she's fighting a fire. They're dealing with the issues that are happening in the Middle East and how that's impacting their cost of operations. They're dealing with the macroeconomic uncertainty that we talked about earlier. This is instantaneous. It's happening now. It's hard to start thinking about something that's not there at the door knocking. Climate change is there, but it's such a, in comparison to what we see on a day-to-day basis, we get such a small sound from the knock from what we're getting from everything else that it's really difficult for them to prioritize it. So that's what we're trying to do. Yeah. We're trying to move this to the top of the prioritization list for investors.
And I think you're doing a great job by that. And like I said, I think a big step is the scientific vetting. To round this conversation up, a question I like to ask in the end is about your optimism. So when we're talking about, okay, we started this conversation with decluttering a little bit why aviation is supposedly one of the, if not the hardest sector to abate. But how optimistic, or are you even optimistic, that the sector is still able to reach its near net zero goals, and what does it need for that?
I'm very optimistic, in fact. I think we're, again, thinking to the long term, I think we're underestimating how quick technology is going to evolve in the next 10 to 15 years. We hear constant babble about AI and what AI is going to do. I'm somewhat a believer in that. I think we're going to see a significant phase change in terms of what humanity can do in the next 5 to 15 years. And that might be, obviously there's the applications of AI that we see right now, generative AI and so on. But also there is physical AI. So physical AI is referring to humanoid robots and so on. Now this might sound really out there, but the reality is this could allow us to be able to experiment really cheaply in the future. So to get an understanding as to what works, and to be able to do that without having to go and build large-scale models, or without having to build full workouts of what is going to be the best solution. So we can do modelling of what's going to work, understand what works, and do it from a desktop. That's a significant advantage. So I'm very optimistic that we can address the problems that are confronting us. But in order to do that, I think what's really important is that we bring everybody together. Mm-hmm. We need to get the airlines, the lessors, the financiers, the policymakers, the oil and gas companies, the SAF producers, and the OEMs, hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody, all to the table. If we think about decarbonisation, this is a problem that really stretches across the industry, and everybody has to play a part in order for it to succeed.
Right, and I mean that's essentially what we're at Impact are trying to do, because we've discovered that it's just happening so much. Everyone is doing their bits and bobs and is working on it, but it's just working a lot in isolation, and a lot of efforts are being duplicated instead of just creating synergies. And I like to ask that question in the end just because it also makes me hopeful. It's always nice to hear speaking to experts about this incredibly difficult how to debate sector and the challenges in different areas, but then almost everyone's ending on the same note like you do and being optimistic, and that's of course hopefully for the people listening to this, but also I can tell you, for me, it's really, really helping to hear. So thank you.
Look, if we weren't optimistic about it, it'd be very, very challenging to even do it. So
to even work on it.
Enrica and the team at Impact are doing great work, and
absolutely,
this is bringing voices together.
Yes, perfect. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you soon in one of our digital rooms.
Exactly. Thank you, Leonie.
Thank you. Bye.